Good morning, BSED 2A. So, for today, we are going to talk about traditional literature. Now, along our discussion, we will be discovering the different characteristics of this kind of literature as well as its types. Now, for each type of traditional literature, we will be discovering some examples that might be very familiar to you. So, without further ado, let's start. When we say traditional literature, these are the stories that have shaped cultures for centuries, and they are much more than just simple tales. At its core, traditional literature consists of stories specifically aimed or made for children and adolescents. But they aren't just for fun. They are intentionally created to both entertain and teach important values like bravery, honesty, and kindness. So probably at this point, nanay nasud sa inyo na huna kung unsa ang mga examples of stories that belong under traditional literature. What's really fascinating is how these stories survived. They were passed down from generation to generation. So when we say traditional literature, basin masud sa tong huna ba nga sinauna or kinaraan. So during that period, during that time, there were no books. That's why this type of literature or this kind of literature originated as oral traditions or told by word of mouth around campfires or at bedtime. Now, since wala pa may books and or even materials during that time to somehow record these stories and turn them into books, they were only written down much later. So dugay-dugay jud sila na record. Because of that, we view them as collective works. They aren't just one person's imagination. Rather, they are a community's way of explaining nature, their beliefs, and their daily practices. So sa una, ang mga kabataan wala jud kaayo idea since wala may books to provide them with factual information regarding the different phenomena or events around them. That's why some of the elderly people during that time would create some stories to somehow or partially answer their queries. That's why when you read a folk tale or a myth, you're looking at the DNA of a culture. So when you are reading a traditional literature, you're not just merely reading a story. You are already looking into the core or the foundation of a particular culture. Now let's talk about the main themes that covered this type of literature.
So now let's talk about the four common themes, which are the good versus evil, the strong versus weak, the beauty versus ugliness, and the rich versus poor. So first is the good versus evil. So heroes triumph over wicked forces like evil stepmothers or witches, emphasizing morality and hope. So the second one is the strong versus the weak. So the overly proud strong falls during storms, while flexible weak survive. So warning against arrogance. So the third one is the beautiful versus ugliness. So beauty signals virtue or divinity, while ugliness ties moral flaws or isolation, as in myths where looks reflect character. The last one is the rich versus the poor. So wealth hides sins and enables access, unlike the judge poor. Tales critique class hypocrisy where saints favor the rich.
Now, moving on to the key characteristics. Traditional literature reflects universal truths that guides the story, such as good versus evil. The plot of the stories in traditional literature is simple and straightforward, making the story easy to follow. The characters are less complex, often follow archetypes where the hero is pure hearted and the villain is clearly evil. The main characters may be human, animals, or gods. The setting is timeless and usually magical, allowing people from many generations to relate to the story. Finally, the story ends with a clear resolution where good triumphs over evil, and the protagonists live happily ever after.
Here are the classification of traditional literature. First, we have the legends, myths, fairy tales, fables, and epics. So, legends legends is a type of folklore about a person or place. It came from the Latin word legends or legendus, meaning to read or word reading. It originally passed on orally and later written. It is believed to be historical but not fully proven, and often explores themes like heroism, truth, betrayal, revenge, choices, and mortality. So, legends are traditional stories passed down through generations that are often connected to real people, places, or historical events. While they may have some basis on reality, legends usually include exaggerated or supernatural elements that make the story more meaningful and engaging. The next we have the example of legend is the Robin Hood, the Legend of Atlantis, and the Legend of King Arthur. So, the legend of Robin Hood is a very prominent legendary figure of all time. He is known as an Englishman of the medieval period. He was an outlaw and was a known enemy to the Sheriff of Nottingham. He became famous due to his compassion for the poor. He steals from the rich to feed and give money to the poor. So, this legend, kaning Legend of Robin Hood, is very familiar. Nasa ni siya movie ani. Then next, we have the Legend of Atlantis. So, the Legend of Atlantis was told by many philosophers, including Plato and Aristotle, about approximately 9,000 years ago. The island of Atlantis that lay beyond Hercules' pillars existed. The Greeks dubbed it as the Holy City. It is a place where the advanced utopian civilization lived who were first spiritual and virtual people. They developed greed and became morally degraded. They lived for their immoral pursuits. The gods became angry and made the island sink along with its people and treasures. So, in short, Munggod, The Legend of Atlantis is a tale about a powerful and advanced civilization that mysteriously sank into the sea. Then, last example is we have the Legend of King Arthur. So, King Arthur is a legendary British king who became a ruler of Camelot after pulling the sword Excalibur from the stone, proving he was the right hire. Guided by the magician Merlin, he won many battles with the help of his knights and married Guinevere, but his life ended tragically due to betrayal involving his sister Morgan Le Fay and their son Mordred. The legend became famous for its memorable characters, magical elements, and many versions that continue to entertain audiences, especially children and adolescents. So, nasa ni Cecilida ni katong The Kid Who Would Be King. Kana nga movie is my favorite yun. And that movie portrayed the legend of King Arthur.
Alright, good afternoon once again. So let's move on to the next classification. We have here myth. So myth is symbolic stories that usually talk about gods, goddesses, demigods, and superhuman beings. These stories came from unknown origins and were shared orally or before they were written down. So myths are closely connected to the religion and our beliefs like that, and they were created to help people understand things they could not explain before, such as um, natural event, human behavior, and natural event. So we have here the examples. So we have the god of Olympus and Cupid and Psyche. So that example is belongs to the myth. So that would be the myth. Also we have fairy tale. So fairy tale help children learn the difference between God and the devil, and they usually show that good characters face consequences. So one day, if na kay good na character, na possibilities nga um, mag-atubang juga og mga consequences. So the plot of fairy tale is often simple and easy to follow. Most fairy tale begins with familiar lines like familiar kanin na to. Ang line nga once upon a time on in an fairyland, which immediately tells the audience that the stories is imaginary and magical. We have here example. We have Cinderella, Snow White, and Beanstalk. No, Jack and Beanstalk. So that would be the example of the fairy tales. I know that kaning mga example la kay familiar na nato tanan. So these stories usually end with a happy ending commonly. The line and they live happily ever after, which shows that peace and happiness were achieved in the end. So that would be the fairy tale. Thank you.
The fables and epic. So, first, what is fables? Fables is a short fictional stories meant to teach a moral and entertain. The characters are animals that represent human traits. It is simple, straightforward plot that ends with a clear lesson. For example, the tortoise and hare, the fox and the grapes, the Charlotte's Web. Then the next is epic. Epic is a long narrative poem about heroic deeds of extraordinary individuals. It originates from the Greek epos, meaning story or poem, and features heroes with superhuman qualities facing great challenges. For example, the Iliad and Odyssey, the Morphogo Beowulf, the Mahabharata.